Hi folks, a Y Guy here again. This video might be just a little bit longer than usual. I try to keep it under 15 minutes, but there's so much to cover on this. This has been one of the most fun, fascinating, enjoyable research and studies I have ever done. This is titled "The Y Guy Asks Who Was Lazarus and the Rich Dude." Okay, I'm going to start by mentioning context. When I say context, I don't mean a verse before, a verse after, or the whole chapter of whatever you're reading. I'm talking about something that's far deeper and greater than that. And I want to lay a foundation first by saying, in this story of Lazarus and the rich man, who was speaking? It was Jesus. Who was he speaking to? A crowd. Who was the crowd? They were Jews. All right, now that's just a foundation. It gets much deeper than that. Now, when you think of a crowd of people, you have to kind of reference in context, what did Jesus have to say about a crowd of people? And how did he address them? In Matthew 13:34, Jesus spoke all these things to the crowd in parables. He did not say anything to them without using a parable. Now this is a double emphasis was said here. I hope you caught that. It's something like truly, truly, and verily, verily. This one is parable, parable. It mentioned it 2 times. So it must be taken seriously that Jesus would not teach a crowd without using parables. Now you ask yourself, with this story of Lazarus and the rich man, who was speaking? Jesus. Who was he speaking to? A crowd. This was a parable. That's all I'm going to say about that at this point. Now you have to ask yourself, why a parable? Jesus answered why a parable in a couple of different places. He said in Matthew 13:13, while seeing they do not see, while you will keep on hearing, but you will not understand. You will keep seeing, but will not perceive. And yet later on, before in Matthew 4:12, he said, so that while seeing they may see and not perceive, and while hearing they may hear and not understand. Otherwise, now get this, otherwise, this is fascinating. Otherwise they might return and be forgiven. That is incredible. They might return and be forgiven. It seems like Jesus is sabotaging people to understand and be forgiven. I find that fascinating. The point here is about timing. Okay? It's about timing. Who is Jesus speaking to? Who is speaking to the Jews, the house of Israel? It's not yet their time to see and understand and be forgiven. It's all about God's timing, folks, not about religion's teaching of timing. All right? Also, another important point here is they did not see. If you don't see something, it's unseen to you. The word unseen is critical in this. To understand. For an example, I just don't get it. What you're saying, Y Guy. I just don't see it. I don't know where you're coming from. I just don't get it. I just can't see it. It's unseen. If you were to put your hands in front of your face, everything beyond your hand would be unseen to you. Oftentimes, I'm going to get onto how Jesus approached this word here in just a moment. Before we do so, I'm going to go in context to history. About 300 to 350 BC, Alexander the Great went to Jerusalem, captured Jerusalem, and as it was done in those days, he would take a few of those folks and distribute them throughout Greece as servants and slaves. Now what happened next is just incredible to me in history. Around 250 BC, around that time, well, the Hebrew people, the Jewish people couldn't speak or read Hebrew any longer, the vast majority of them. So the Greek people took upon themselves, which was no easy task. They didn't have computers and printing presses. They took upon themselves the task of translating the Hebrew manuscripts and scriptures to Greek. They translated to Greek, and today it's called the Septuagint. Now, here's something that the Greek people did. They understood something that the Christians of today don't get. Just don't get it. It's unseen. Anyway, when they translated this, even though the Greek people themselves believed in an afterlife and the negative side of their version of hell, while translating the Hebrew to Greek, not one time they knew that the Jews didn't believe in a place called hell. They knew that way back then at 250 BC. They never put hell in the Septuagint, not even once. That's significant. Now let's fast forward now about 280 years later, where Jesus is sharing this parable. He was speaking to whom? To Jews. Jesus, through and through, was a Hebrew child. He was raised Hebrew, taught Hebrew. He was Orthodox Jew. He was even considered a rabbi. He would never, ever take a something from Greek mythology like Hades, or something from paganistic view of hell, and use that word. He never spoke that word in this parable, not once. And yet, the majority of our Bibles translate where the rich man is speaking to Abraham, looking up from this place called hell. And yet Jesus never spoke that word. It never came out of his mouth. The correct translation for that is unseen. Remember? Unseen? You just don't get it? It's unseen. Now let me clarify that. Jesus, oftentimes speaking of death, he would speak of being asleep. Now when you're asleep, you don't perceive, you don't understand, you don't see. Everything around you is unseen. It's not comprehended. Okay? That is what it's all about. That's why he used the word unseen. And it'll come clear here when you find out who he is and why he's not seeing and not understanding, not perceiving. All right? It all comes down to that. Now, there are three significant characters in this parable. There's Abraham, there's Lazarus, and there's this rich guy. Now, if you noticed something, that Abraham and Lazarus were mentioned by name as individuals, but yet the rich man is not mentioned as an individual. There's a reason for that. Let's start out with Abraham. In order to understand true context, you have to go back and read some of Abraham's story. Back before he and Sarah could have any munchkins, before Isaac was ever born, all right, Abraham had this man servant, this best friend, this confidant. Probably he even looked at him as a son he never had. And the reason I can say that is because he was so close to Abraham's heart. He was in Abraham's bosom. I wonder where that term came from. You think about that just for a second. Abraham's bosom. Now, the reason why I can say he was like a son to him is because Abraham was going to allow this man to be an heir to all of his to his estate, and not just his estate, but the Abrahamic covenant as well. This man's name was Eliezer, and guess what, folks? He was a Gentile. Abraham was planning on leaving all of the inheritance, the promises of God, the covenant, to a Gentile. Now, I not often, but while doing this research, I wondered if God would have allowed Abraham to do that instead of giving him Isaac. I wonder if Jesus would have been born a Gentile. That's just an interesting sideline. Well, anyway, if you take the name Eliezer and translate it in the Greek, the name is Lazarus. Isn't that fascinating? Okay, Abraham represents the promises of God in this parable. Lazarus represents the Gentile nations. Now, who is this person unnamed as an individual? Who is this rich man? Well, from God's perspective, being rich means to know him. Knowing him makes us rich. Which nation on earth, both in that time and times before this parable and times after the parable, which nation is considered the one that's supposed to represent God, be the ambassadors of God, the one that knows the one and only true God, the one that is rich in the knowledge of God and his character? Which nation was that was responsible for that? Israel. All right. Now, another confirmation to that is the purple robes represent, that this rich man was wearing represents royalty. Does the royal priesthood come to mind as a definition of Israel as well? You see, there is no doubt in my mind that Abraham represents the promises of God. In this parable, Lazarus represents a Gentile nation, and the rich man represents Israel. Okay, it makes sense when you look at it like that. It makes complete sense. Now, I want to address some terminology that was used, some dialogue that was used back and forth between this rich man and Abraham. And he's talking about a tormenting flame. If you notice, first off, I want to say I believe every one of these point to Jesus. Every single every bit of this dialogue points to Jesus. It's so fascinating. When I discovered this, I was in awe. But you be the judge, okay? This tormenting flame, torment simply in the Greek means to test, a testing flame. Flame is a singular word. You notice it didn't say flames. When you think of fire, you think of flames. But yet, when you look in the Greek of fire, fire is mentioned hundreds and hundreds of times in the Bible. And it's all translated as pure, P-U-R. That's where we get our word pure from. Now, this word flame in the Greek is flax, P-H-L-A-X. And it simply means flash. Like a flash of light, a revelation. Jesus is the light of our life. Okay, flash, news. I remember seeing that on some of the old broadcasts. Flash. And they would tell you the news. Well, guess what, folks? Flash. Jesus is the good news. I believe flame here is pointing to Jesus. I really do. Now let's look at another word. Well, tongue doesn't represent Jesus. Tongue represents taste to me, and God says, come, see that I taste good. But what did this rich man want to taste? He wanted water. Jesus is the living water. And to this day, oh, well, let me back up. Jesus would say that if you drink of me, you'll thirst no more. This rich man was thirsty. And to this very day, Israel hasn't tasted him yet as a nation. They're still thirsty. Okay? When it's mentioned prophet and stuff, the prophets, Abraham said, you know, I've sent the prophets to you. Well, who did the prophets all point to? Jesus. See, it's all about him, folks. This whole thing, all the terminology, everything in this. What about when send somebody back, raise somebody from the dead, warn my brothers, and whatever. I don't have the scripture in front of me. Folks, and the response was that won't do any good. Guess what? Jesus was raised from the dead. Didn't do any good. They still don't get it. It's still unseen to the rich man. Not getting it. To this very day, Israel just isn't getting it. Okay? Now how about this gulf, this great divide? Who is the great divide? Jesus is the divide. He's what divides us. Back and forth. You can't go back and forth. A Christian can't say, well, I'm going to denounce Christ as the Messiah, and I'm going to go put my lawn chair on the roof of some apartment in Israel, and I'm going to sit there and wait for the coming of the Messiah. We know he already came. There's a great divide between us in beliefs. We can't go back and forth. You don't flip-flop on this whole thing. There's a great divide between us. And it's all pointing to Jesus. He is the divide. He's what divides the house of Israel to the Gentile nation. It's Jesus. He is the divide. Okay, I've said that enough. Now, an important aspect of this parable is the word death. A story could have been told without using the word death, and it was told many times. Let me back up by saying that this parable is the 7th parable. Okay, 6 other parables points out a main theme. Before I get to that theme, death, Lazarus died, and the rich man died. That's important to know. Why? Because Jesus always said, unless a seed dies, it cannot bear forth fruit. When Jesus shared this parable, the gospel, the good news, was dead, both to the house of Israel and to the Gentile nation. However, after Christ was raised from the dead, part of that fruit that came out of that was the Gentiles became alive in Christ. The Gentiles are the one carrying the torch. Okay, bearing fruit. And guess who's still dead? The house of Israel. Metaphorically speaking, the house of Israel is still dead to the gospel. It's still unseen to them. They're still in that place of unseen. So it's amazing how all this plays out. So it is not about heaven and hell. It has nothing to do with heaven and hell, this parable. Absolutely nothing. And yet this is the main one that Christians use to confirm their belief in some place called hell. Folks, it's all about stewardship. All these parables, all 7 of them are about stewardship. How was Israel handling, how was the house of Israel, the Jews handling God, the character of God. They slandered his character with the law. They took away from the true meaning of having a relationship with God and replaced it with law. How does that work? The Christian church, in some instances, are slandering the character of God by replacing God with doctrines of men and traditions of men and paganism. And I'm telling you, folks, this hell doctrine is one of the big boys that's slandering God worse than about anything that's out there. And it needs to be reconsidered. And that's why I'm doing these videos, is try to plant seeds of doubt so people will research this and reconsider their thoughts about this. I hope this hasn't been too long. My future videos is going to be on the separating the sheep from the goats, as well as the lake of fire. It's going to be another fascinating research and study from a different paradigm. So, signing off for now. Thank you for viewing.